Hey there, my name is Douglas, and I'm with Regina Gilbert from the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, and really excited to talk about accessibility and inclusion, especially in the world of virtual reality. And we were even just talking about how the pandemic can be a lens into how we think about inclusion and how things affect us in different ways and how we need to consider how things affect others. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So I was just telling you earlier, it's always really fascinating to talk to professors and teachers that are working with younger folks, or at least folks that might be, that have that beginner's mindset, that are curious and exploring things and hungry to just seeing the world in a new way. And um, so you're doing a lot of work with them around just even helping them understand what diversity and or rather accessibility and inclusion is.
hmm
And what are those kind of aha moments that they have, those epiphanies that come to them when they're first kind of working with your class?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do is I do start my classes with accessibility, and then I incorporate it into the class throughout. And what students find is that um, they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize that this thing was an accessibility feature on my phone, right?"
Mm,
Or I didn't realize, when I don't have my glasses and I have to make things larger, that's part of, so I think that they start to see the world differently as they go throughout the course and seeing where where accessibility exists, where it doesn't, and where there are opportunities for it.
that's fascinating. It's like it's having a new vocabulary and a new kind of way to compartmentalize these things that they're interacting with.
I say that, design is a way of thinking. And although I am a teacher, I'm an educator, I cannot teach anyone anything, right? I can only hope that the questions I ask will prompt you to think.
That's brilliant. It reminds me of some leadership advice that I often give, which is, or even in the world of facilitation, folks are often like, well, "How do I make someone do X, Y, or Z?" And I'm like, "Well, we don't." But you think of yourself as a gardener. You don't make the plants grow, but you can set the conditions that they
Right.
might be more apt to grow, for sure. So I'm really fascinated by your work in virtual reality. So how, or specifically, where do you see the most opportunity or the most hope when you look at these design patterns that you're starting to unpack and understand?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm working on is working with a group called Veil, and I'm also working with a grad assistant. And we're looking at design patterns in virtual reality. So going through a game experience, or not necessarily game experience, but a virtual reality experience, and then noting the locomotion. So what's the movement like in there? What options are there in the settings? What can I do? Do I have to pick things up? Do I have to, move my arms? Can I do things seated? Can I do things standing? Right. So these are all things to consider when going through an experience. And we are documenting these design patterns. And the hope is that in the future, we'll have an idea of what is being used and then what could be other options for future use. Because one of my friends runs a VR meetup, and he had one meetup where it said 97, and I won't get the number quite right, but it's like 97.89% of people in the world have not tried virtual reality.
Mm. Isn't it amazing to think? Like I was looking at Oculus back in December and just thinking about how it's no longer tethered. It's
Mhm.
$300. It just seemed like it's so much more approachable. I was expecting it to take off. and it's still, maybe the price point needs to drop even further
Yeah, I
potentially.
mean it's sold pretty well, but it's still not something that's adopted by the masses. And I actually saw something posted yesterday where it said people who have the VR headsets, not somebody who works in the field, um, usually uses it about once a month.
Yeah. And it's a gaming device, right? I think there's this like, it's almost, I think a little bit, it's not quite the uncanny valley kind of problem, but it's a little bit of like, how do you jump this chasm between gaming and entertainment over into like, productive use kind of utility type of tools. And I think when that starts to happen, you will start, when it's impacting people's daily lives, that's when it's really gonna maybe make
Yeah,
a big
I
shift.
think I think we're going to see advancements when it comes to telework, virtual offices, and conferences, because we already have seen it with the pandemic. We saw more virtual events that were, with 3D avatars, which is considered like web VR. We saw Burning Man was entirely, a lot of it was in virtual reality last year. So I think I see a future where there's a hybrid of people will be at real life events, but people will also be in these virtual worlds.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating just that statistic alone, because if you think about just the impact the adoption curve could make from a pure user generated content standpoint, because the more people you have creating content and putting ideas into the system, the more rich it will be, right? Because then you're going to have more perspectives. It's just going to be a more diverse pool of awesome stuff to explore. I mean, it's the same thing as the internet when it was like, it was when it was 1,000 pages versus like, billions of pages. It's like a totally different world. Like you
Yeah.
didn't need Google back in '93, right?
Right. You just went there to that site,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the site didn't change for years.
right.
I mean, the beauty of like going into the Wayback Machine is seeing like, what did Yahoo look like? Wow, that's a lot of text. We've kind of gotten away from all, a screen full of text. But also one of the things, years ago, I went to an assistive technology conference, through, it was run through Cal State Northridge, and Marcy Sutton, who's an incredible accessibility expert developer, did a presentation on I think the movie Captain Marvel was coming out or something, and also she was like talking about the website and how the movie itself is kind of based in the 90s, but the website was not as accessible as it would have been in the 90s. And then she said, well, go take a look at Space Jam, because the original Space Jam website is still up. And she's like, that is actually an accessible site, which is kind of
Wow.
shocking, a little bit.
Yeah, that's amazing. So like
Yeah.
how some of our like, and we were talking about this in the pre-show chat, this notion of, in our efforts to make stuff more tantalizing or more exciting or more kind of futurized, it can leave folks behind,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
and I was even thinking like even efforts to be more accessible could like, it's an ever evolving problem, right? It's a complex problem because let's say that we focus on folks that we focus on one type of issue, like maybe hearing loss, right, or maybe vision issue, right? And we're let's do a brain to computer interface. Well, then what happens when people have some neurodiversity, or maybe the way their neurons are structured is slightly, it has some abnormal anatomy that's maybe only affects like 5% of the population, and it's like only slightly different enough to where it's never been studied or noticed, but like when you put this apparatus on, it like gives them headaches, right? So
Yeah.
they can't use it, right? And so now that 5% is excluded from this awesome new experience, and we have this whole new problem, right? It's
Yep.
like almost every new invention will create new accessibility concerns that have to be studied and understood.
Well, yeah, and one of the ways that that could be alleviated is if folks start to incorporate and hire folks with disabilities and bring them
Yes.
in so that they're part of the conversation and not brought in later when things are already made and then it's too late to go back and make the changes. In the disability community, there's a phrase, "Nothing about us without us." So
Oh, that's yeah.
yeah, if folks are working on stuff, then make sure to incorporate, you know, a wide variety of folks. I like to throw out this statistic that in the United States, by the year 2035, there will be more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 65. Meaning that whether we like it or not, we're going to have to start to make accessible things
Yeah.
because we're going to have more older people in this country than younger people. And we also need to be nice to our older adults because we're becoming them.
Yeah.
And I think people start to experience things early. Oh, I can't open this jar, or why is this font so small? I can't read this label. So already I think we start to experience these things as we age. Like I've done a workshop in the past called Designing for Your Future Self, where I have folks think about this because it's important. Why aren't we starting now to get ready for our older selves? That's part of why I got into researching virtual reality, augmented reality, because I want to use this stuff when I get older. And so what options could be made available for me if I don't have the dexterity in my hands, or I'm already wearing glasses. People don't tend to think of glasses as assistive technology, but it is.
Yeah, it was like, what is that proverb? It's like the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago.
Right.
So if you need it in 10 years, start planting the seeds now. So it's kind of like, what you're saying is like, let's design for this so that when I'm there, I'll have what I need. I think
Exactly.
that's really smart. Yeah. So you also talked a bit about voice interfaces too, and the history of voice. And so I'm curious what you found in that exploration.
Well, I think, we tend to nowadays we have Siri and Alexa and Google Home, but we voice user interfaces have been around for quite some time. You know, we voice when people call for banking. I don't think people think about that from a voice user interface perspective. And I'm still exploring as I am going to be prepping for. I am prepping for a course that's starting this upcoming fall that I'll be teaching a voice user interface course to some undergraduate students. So, yeah, there is a lot incorporated into the history of voice that we don't think about from early on. And a lot of it was telephone based.
Mm,
And, how many people watching still have home phones,
yeah.
right? Like
You know,
that's, and we tend not to think about the when we don't use things, we tend not, out of sight, out of mind, right? So, I'll be exploring with my students just briefly, like the history of voice and how it was used, because I don't think, I mean, a lot of us still deal with customer service voice, right? And all of this has been made by design. All of it had to be scripted out. All of it had to, be prepared for somebody screaming at it. And, me, I just pressed 0 so I could get a real person.
right,
Everything,
right.
yeah.
It makes me think. There are a couple things that I thought of. One was how I've known some startups that are doing like chatbot interfaces that are somewhat, they're not voice, but they're text based. So there's a very similar design process, if you will, maybe lacking the intonation, but still there's like narrative happening. And they were really focused on the personality that this thing had, so that it wasn't just robotic, like a menu of options that maybe had a voice or identity thrown onto it. Like it actually could tell jokes, or it like could kind of somewhat sense like what was going on. But then I think there's a maybe if I think about the work that you do and add another layer here, I think there's another thing to study and think about, which is like which is representation. You
Yes,
know,
that's one of the things I definitely um, have thought about and would like to incorporate because um, I have a friend who did a presentation on why Siri sounds so white and
yeah,
not um, if you have any sort of accent, a lot of times these voice assistants don't understand you. I have a friend who grew up in Philadelphia and Alexa never understands him and he gets super frustrated and it's because it's the way it was made.
yeah. And the assumptions and who was in the room when it was made. I mean, it's not super thick, but I grew up in Southern Virginia, so every now and then there's some southernness in the way I speak, and so those Google Voice, Alexa, Siri will sometimes have trouble, and I'll have to slow down and enunciate very carefully, and that's like, but also it it's not only the understanding, but it's the connection you have with the do I feel like I'm like I've brought in this person into my home that I don't feel like is part of my community. I mean,
Right.
that's a psychological
Oh yeah,
um
there's some
like
stuff there.
leap, I would say.
Yeah. There's some stuff and not being understood, right? Like we as humans, we look to connect with each other and we really look to be heard,
Mm,
right? I mean, so many people are just screaming because they want to be heard. And when a system doesn't understand you, I mean, I've watched videos of people trying um, the different Google Homes and Alexas, and when they're not understood, you could see the disappointment on their face. So it goes deeper than a general misunderstanding and to people's emotions.
mm. Wow. Man, I feel like we could talk and talk and talk, and I love the work that you're doing. It's much needed, and it's also incredible that you're working with students to, shape the minds of the next generation to be focused on these topics because, they're the ones that are going to be developing these things that we have to use
Right.
as we get over 65. So that's
Yep.
so great. And I just want to thank you for coming on today for this quick live stream and it was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.